And this is one of the points that needs to be emphasized. It is true that Islam expanded into the areas north of Arabia by conquest. And it is also true that Islam spread across North Africa by conquest. However, Islam did not spread south of the Sahara by conquest. The Arabs did not conquer Africa south of the Sahara and created an Islamic civilization. No, you have a number of processes by which Islam would move from North Africa to the sub-Saharan region of Africa. This is where you have the 5 agencies by which Islam was spread south of the Sahara. As I pointed out, long before the Arabs came to the scene, you already had the Carthaginians who were there, and they did have some trade. We read in Herodotus, the Greek traveler and writer, that you have the Garamantes, and the troglodytes, in that part of the world, and there were connections between the Greeks and the Carthaginians, as we know later on, with people south of the Sahara. Now, from the Roman historians, Greek historians, you know that there were some connections between people at the periphery of the desert and the people who were further to the north of the desert in North Africa. But it was only after the coming of the Arabs that we now begin to see human agency penetrating the Sahara and reaching points south of the Sahara, deep enough. And the Arabs were able now to travel by camel for several weeks across the Sahara, which is the largest desert in the world, to points south of the Sahara. And this would lead to the development of several trade routes into sub-Saharan Africa, beginning from Egypt all the way up to Marrakesh in Morocco. You have this number of routes that you can take, points from the north to sub-Saharan region. And the Arabs were able to penetrate through these different routes to penetrate. You have the Kordofan, Darfur part, you have the Tripoli part, you have the Tlemcen part, and then you have part leading into Timbuktu, and then the Marrakesh. Now, what the Arabs were able to do with their knowledge of the camel and their knowledge of traveling across the desert was to develop what one British writer called, E.V. Boville called it, the golden trade of the Moors. That the Arabs were able now to get gold south of the Sahara to North Africa, to Europe, and to the East. And of course, this made gold a very important item of trade between North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. The point that we need to make here is the fact that as a result of this interaction between Sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa, you now have human agency in the form of trade and commerce. And these Arab traders would now become agents for the dissemination of Islam. And as a result of their interaction with African societies south of the Sahara, through what social scientists would call the demonstration effect, because as these Arab traders traveled to sub-Saharan Africa, they became the guests of African peoples. Now, what is very interesting here really is that when you look at the history of that transaction, you find that these Africans were practicing their own tradition, what Muslims will call, these are Jahiluns. They are practicing the religion of the Jahils, people who are really in a state of ignorance, unexposed to monotheism. And of course, the Africans on their side felt that these people were strangers who practiced a different religion. And of course, the kings and the nobles of the African side had vested interest in this trade because it brought all these luxury goods from the Mediterranean or the East, while at the same time they were exporting ivory, ostrich feathers, and other things south of the Sahara going north. And of course, so you can see that through this trade and commerce, Islam began to be exposed to the Africans through demonstration, not through proselytization, but through demonstration, because the Africans were now beginning to see the Arabs practice their religion. Now, one thing that attracted the Africans was the fact that these Arabs will stop buying and selling the moment they call the azan, the call for prayer. The moment the call for prayer was made, these Arabs will stop everything they were doing. That was one thing that struck the Africans, that these people believed their God so strongly that they will stop every human activity to go and pray. So that began to influence some of the Africans, and some of the African nobles decided to link up with the Arabs. And of course, they gradually became Muslim. That's a very interesting pattern of conversion in the African context, in the sense that the African nobility became Muslim before the masses, which is not typical, because if you look at the history of Islam and Christianity, it's always the poor people, the rejected, who will join the religion. But in this particular case, the upper classes began to gravitate towards Islam. Well, some would say in retrospect out of self-interest, because it gave them power of literacy, it gave them access to a civilizational center and all that. Some people have suggested this. But regardless of what was the motivation, the fact remains that through trade and commerce, Islam gradually gained ground among the African nobles. And of course, in ancient Ghana, which was still a traditional African kingdom with idols and their own way of worshipping their creator, remain a non-Muslim state. But ancient Ghana was very much influenced by these Arab traders. Now, there are some scholars who write from an African nationalist point of view, who seem to suggest that in 1076, when ancient Ghana collapsed, it collapsed likely because the Arab Muslims' penetration of the region weakened the ideological foundation of the society. That's from a nationalist point of view. You used to have some African nationalists who argue along those lines. There are some African Americans, Afrocentrics, who will argue along those lines. But the evidence really suggests that ancient Ghana itself was internally decayed.
The second great king, Sakuru, was a Muslim. Remember, Ghana was destroyed by Muslims. Mali was nominal Muslim, I mean the royal family was Muslim. We have not studied the black side of Islam, because the black side of Islam had nothing to do with Arab or Arabism. Now, the next king of the country is the best known of all of the African kings of that period. He came to power in 1306. He was the kind of the showboy of ancient, of medieval Africa, called Mansa Musa, a devout Muslim. He went on the trip to Mecca and Medina, 1324, spent years preparing for it. He had brought all the territory, the neighboring territory, into his empire. As he prepared to go on this trip, special gold was a symbol for the trip. 250 bondsmen marched in front of his entourage, staffs of pure gold. 250 camels, each with 250 pounds of gold. When he went through countries that had a little depression, when he left, they had prosperity. He dug swimming pools, luxury. He had 50 royal hairdressers, and he only carried his favorite wives. When he arrived in Egypt, he was so splendid, they said, "He is Africa, there is nothing else." On his way home, this is no ordinary king, so no ordinary homecoming present is good for him. His army had captured the neighboring kingdom of Sangay. They gave him a nation as a homecoming present. He went through this nation, so with an architect, Ibn Asak. They took a sleepy mosque called Senkori and developed it into one of the great universities of late medieval Africa. One of the main reasons why the female had freedom in the marketplace is that inner West Africa was Islamized by Islamized blacks who knew what custom to leave alone. East Africa was Islamized by Arabs who destroyed the matrilineal and installed the patrilineal, lined by the male descent. Go to Senegal right now. The women are still masters of the marketplace. You see them walking around, you see men with that little machine making suits. But at the end of the day, you want to know who's the boss. See that lady with that big skirts on, tied around her waist, enough money to float a bank. She's paying off her help. She ain't got no bodyguard, ain't nobody gonna bother her. She's the boss in the Muslim country. Because the matrilineal still prevails. Lineage through the female side. Lineage did not mean dominance. Because the American man, the European man, is so afraid of women. He's always safeguarding himself against her. And we imitate him sometimes because we live among him. Now, the structure thing about this second great independent state in West Africa is that those two princes got home and spread the news of Mali's weakness after the death of Mansa Musa. And though they were twins, when Ali Colon was proclaimed Soni Ali, liberator, he would set in motion the largest and the last of the great independent states in West Africa. Because this state would be a consolidation of Ghana and Mali, all consolidated in one state and still controlling the gold trade across the universe, across the Sahara. Now with a great university, Senkori, and a university city, Dijen, or Geni, with its great universities, not one university, but a city devoted almost solely to education. Arabs coming down into the Western Sudan could not get a job at Senkori because the great master scholars taught 10 subjects and had to teach them well. Now, Soni Ali the second, 1464, 1492. The slave trade had already started along the coast. These independent states in inner West Africa went on to their golden age in spite of it and in the midst of it. But the slave trade had not destroyed all the coastal states in West Africa, but some were disrupted by the slave trade. In East Africa, some of the great trading states remained. But the Arab slave trade had started 1,000 years before the European slave trade. What the brothers who favor Islam fail to understand is that the Arab was a traditional slave trader before
And
Islam.
I'm not here today to stand in front of you and say that slavery did not exist in the Muslim world, and there were not people who were quote-unquote Muslims who were not involved in slave raiding or slave trading. What I am here basically to show you is that there is a difference between a person who is actually practicing Islam in the proper way, according to Sharia, the Islamic law, and a person who has an Islamic name, who comes from a Muslim family and carries out what they want to carry out anyway. There's a difference between the two. You might find a person, well, iyadu billah, may Allah protect us from it, who is a Muslim, you might find them drinking alcohol. Muslims don't drink alcohol, but you might find somebody who drinks. That's his problem. That is not Islam that made him do that. That is the choice that the individual made to carry it out. When you look at the history of Islam in the era that is called in Islamic jurisprudence the time of the Salaf as-Salih, this is the first 3 generations of Islam. You find within that early time there is no slave raiding that is going on. There is no historical report that shows that Muslims were involved in slave raiding or in slave trading, as it happened later on in Islamic history. That is the source for Islamic lifestyle. And so people have practiced Islam based upon their understanding of their relationship with the Creator and their ability to perform the Sharia. When African people were taken into slavery from the west coast of Africa, and quiet as it's kept, we are now understanding that maybe close to 30% of the slaves taken from the Guinea coast of West Africa were Muslims. Close to 30%. In Bahia, in Brazil, which was the largest slave population created by the Portuguese, there was a huge slave revolt in Bahia, a successful slave revolt, to the point where the Hausa and the Fulani or the Fula people who were taken into slavery in that part of the world were able to defeat the Portuguese. They were given boats and they returned to West Africa. And you can go to Lagos today and you can find Brazilian mosques, which is a mosque, a house of worship built by people who were captured, taken to Brazil, and then won their liberation and returned to West Africa. You also find that in Suriname, the Bush blacks led a great revolt. And if you go to the interior of Suriname today, you will find African people who are free people, who fought for their liberation. One of the leaders in this revolt, his name was Arabi, and his general was Zamzam. Zamzam is water in Mecca that the Muslims drink. It's been flowing from the time of the Prophet Abraham. This is in Suriname. Also, you find that in Trinidad, Mohammed Cisse and a number of Muslims who were captured prisoners of war or slaves were able to get their freedom and actually get property in Trinidad, and they actually had a society going on in the Caribbean. And you find that all over the Caribbean in the writings now, we are reinterpreting the writings and we understand that when the term Mandingo is being used, they are referring to a Muslim, Mandingo. This is the terminology now. They wouldn't use Muslim, because you have to remember that the Spanish were paranoid of Muslims, because Muslims were in Spain for 700 years. And so the Spanish had to overtake the Muslims in Andalusia, right? Seville, Toledo, Granada, Cordoba. So they didn't want to hear the words Muslim. They wanted to erase it. They just baptized everybody on the boat. And so nobody could use it, especially the Muslims. But still, records are coming to us. In 1821, in the Manchester parish of Jamaica, a document was being passed around which is called wathiqa. Wathiqa. It was written in Arabic. This is a document which is now being linked by Nigerian scholars to a document written by a West African Islamic reviver of the faith. His name was Sheikh Uthman Danfodio, of the Fulani people. He wrote a document which was called Wathiqa ibn Fudi ila Ahl Sudan wa man sha'allahu min al-Ikhwan. This document says it is the document or manifesto of the son of a scholar, Ibn Fudi, to the people of the Sudan, meaning right across West Africa, to the Sudan today, and those whom Allah pleases from the brethren, meaning his students or talaba. This document, Wathiqa, was calling the people to resistance. Resistance. At that time, it was against the petty Hausa kings who were oppressing people in Gobert and other parts of Hausa land. There was a revolt, a resistance that went on in the time of Sheikh Uthman, rahimahullah. What happened now in Jamaica, and the link is being made now, Dr. Usman Bugaje, one of the scholars in northern Nigeria today. I had the opportunity to meet Dr. Usman last summer in Leicester in UK, and he gave me this paper, and he linked it. They were linking it together now. The Wathiqa of Ibn Fudi, they're linking it with the document passed around amongst the slaves in Jamaica, and sure enough, in 1821, there was a slave revolt in the Manchester parish. You also find in Bahamas, I went to the archives in Bahamas and Nassau, and I was surprised to read in one of the documents that it said that a certain amount of slaves were taken to the island of Exuma, and a large number called themselves followers of Mahomet. Now, they didn't know what this term Mahomet was, M-A-H-O-M-E-T. This is the crusading, middle-age definition for the word Muhammad. These people in the Bahamas were defining themselves as Muslims. And so Muslims were one of the groups who resisted oppression and slavery in the Americas. Very interestingly, what has happened to me recently is that Sheikh Fahim Diop, who is a Gambian scholar who is living in New York area and teaching, Sheikh Fahim was linking now the concept of Maroons, the Maroon people, with a strong tribe known in Gambia. This is interesting, because the definition that came to us, and I had the opportunity to visit the Maroon settlements in Jamaica. I was there for 4 years, and the Maroons, basically in Jamaica, were known as, it is said that the word comes from cimarrones, which is a Spanish word for wild horse. Because when the Spanish came, these people were so resilient that they resisted slavery, went into the interior, and the Spanish couldn't get them out. They left them alone. The French came along, left them alone. British came, left them alone. But the British had a plan, because they're very crafty. So they made a treaty. They made a treaty. And in that treaty, they turned the Maroons against other people of African descent. And people who know Jamaican history will know that negative side of the existence. What is important is, what Sheikh Fahim is showing us is that in West Africa, there is a nation of people in Gambia who are of very strong stature, known for their fierce warlike nature. All of them are Muslims, and their name is Maroons. This is serious. This is serious. Because this would link us now, in the name, directly to a nation in West Africa. And research is being done right now to look into the records to see whether this definition really was this so-called Spanish word cimarrones, or actually was it a terminology that had come from an African language that was trying to be covered up by the colonial powers. What is important is that Muslims were resisting slavery. And you find in America, you will find the story of Ayub ibn Sulaiman, who was in Georgia. You find Abdurrahman in Mississippi. You will find Saleh Bilali Muhammad in the Gula Islands. You will find Muslims very strong within African American culture. In mainland United States, the presence is very strong. And it is probably that same spirit of resistance that was passed on from family to family, from generation to generation, that is coming to the surface today within African American society in the name of Islam. And this is a strange phenomenon, because even though the New York Times and the Washington Post and other so-called authentic media publications are trying to put out propaganda against the Muslim world and against Africa and different liberation movements, still people are looking at Islam. We recognize now that there is a link in terms of lineage and in terms of knowledge and resistance. And again, I want to make it clear, it's not only Muslims who resisted slavery in America. There's other groups who are very powerful as well. But we now identify this as one of the strong groups who resisted slavery within the Americas.